When you hear the name Vanderbilt, what truly comes to mind? For most of us, it's a name that feels less like a family and more like an institution. A word that seems forged from steel and gilded in gold, etched onto the very foundations of American history. It conjures a sepia-toned vision of the Gilded Age, of ruthless, cigar-chewing men in dark suits and formidable women in corsets, their faces etched with the relentless ambition of a nation hurtling into modernity. It's the scent of coal smoke and expensive perfume mingling on a New York street, the rumble of a locomotive thundering across the plains, the clinking of champagne glasses in a ballroom so vast it could swallow a city block. We see a legacy of steamships churning the Hudson, of railway lines stitching together a continent, of a fortune so vast it was said to rival the U.S. Treasury itself. It is a landscape of such profound, almost brutal success, of such monumental, unshakable power, that we rarely stop to consider the extraordinary, almost paradoxical human drama at its heart. We see a financial empire, but what we're really looking at is one of the most spectacular and complete collapses in the annals of dynastic history. A fall from grace so total, so absolute, that within a few short generations, a family that once controlled one out of every $20 in America would have no billionaires left among them. This is the story of the Vanderbilts, a name that became synonymous with the raw, unapologetic power of American capitalism, an empire built not on inherited prestige or gentle breeding, but on sheer grit, relentless work, and an unwavering, almost religious belief in the sanctity of a dollar earned, and more importantly, a dollar saved. Their influence quietly shaped the very structure of the American economy, its role in the world, and the physical landscape of its cities for over a century. We see the shores of Newport, the grand avenues of Manhattan, the iron arteries of a rising nation, and even the hallowed halls of a great university, all stamped with the unmistakable Vanderbilt seal. But what if I told you the real story of the Vanderbilt dynasty is not about how they built an empire, but about how, so tragically and so completely, they dismantled it themselves? What if the fatal flaw was not a market crash or a bad investment, but a psychological one, a seed of self-destruction planted by the founder himself, which lay dormant for a generation before blossoming with spectacular, ruinous beauty in his grandchildren? This isn't just a financial history, it's a family tragedy on a grand operatic scale. Today we are pulling back the heavy velvet curtain on one of America's most accomplished and deeply misunderstood dynasties. This is not a story of a business that failed, but of a family that succeeded so completely it sowed the seeds of its own destruction. This is the story of how a patriarch's ferocious discipline forged a path to unimaginable wealth, and how that path led to a pinnacle of splendor that was at once a crowning achievement and a gilded, suffocating cage. This is the Vanderbilt dynasty, the Gilded Cage, and the fall of the House of Cornelius. To understand the world-altering force that the Vanderbilt dynasty would become and the seeds of its eventual spectacular implosion, you must first transport yourself to an America on the anvil, a nation being hammered into a new and unfamiliar shape. Imagine the world into which the family's destiny was forged, the raw, chaotic, and often brutal landscape of the 19th century. This was an America grappling with its own soul, a young nation still smelling of wet paint and fresh-cut timber, a country lurching from an agrarian past into an age of untamed industrial capitalism. It was a world of sprawling cities black with coal smoke, of political machines that ran on graft and patronage, and of a raw, unbridled energy that promised everything to those who were bold enough to take it. There were no safety nets, no income taxes, and very few rules. It was a world that demanded men of iron will, of towering ambition, and of a near-religious devotion to the idea of work as the only true measure of a man. It was in this crucible that Cornelius Vanderbilt forged his destiny, and, with it, the destiny of his family. He was the dynasty's architect, the stern, unyielding patriarch who drew the blueprints for all that was to come. He was not born into the Boston Brahmin aristocracy or the landed gentry of Virginia, families who trace their lineage back to the Mayflower and their fortunes to inherited land. Born in 1794 on the humble, windswept shores of Staten Island, his was a story of pure, unadulterated, bare-knuckle capitalism. He was a product of a world where survival was a daily struggle, a brilliant and ferociously disciplined boy who quit school at age 11, famously declaring, "If I had learned education, I would not have had time to learn anything else." He couldn't spell, and his grammar was atrocious, but he could see the currents of commerce with a clarity that bordered on clairvoyance. At 16, with a $100 loan from his mother, a sum he had to earn by plowing a rocky, unpromising field, he bought his first small ferry boat, a simple periauger with a flat bottom and 2 masts, to transport cargo and passengers between Staten Island and the bustling port of Manhattan. This was not a flight of fancy. It was a calculated risk. Young Cornelius saw a world still dominated by sail, a world of unpredictable winds and slow, laborious journeys. He was betting on himself, on his own strength and reliability, promising to make his runs on time, every time, regardless of the weather. He was his own engine, a human machine of pure will. Cornelius, who would earn the nickname Commodore for his mastery of the shipping lanes, was the quintessential patriarch of his era, stern, deeply practical, emotionally walled off, and relentlessly driven. He was a man of legendary coarseness. He swore like a sailor, chewed tobacco until his chin was stained brown, and was known to consult spiritualists and psychics, particularly after the death of his beloved wife and cousin Sophia. This turn to the supernatural wasn't a sign of weakness, but a manifestation of his obsessive need for control, an attempt to gain an edge, an answer, in a world of uncertainty, even beyond the grave. But in business, he was a creature of pure, cold logic. He established a shipping empire by embracing the revolutionary new technology of the steamboat and then weaponizing it against his competitors. His signature tactic was the rate war. He would slash his fares to impossibly low levels, sometimes even offering free passage, driving his rivals, with their higher overhead and weaker nerves, into bankruptcy. Then, with the competition eliminated, he would buy their ships for pennies on the dollar, absorb their routes, and jack up the rates. It was brutal, it was predatory, and it made him spectacularly rich. He was a shark in a sea of minnows, and he devoured them whole. His ambition wasn't confined to the waters around New York. During the California gold rush, he saw that the established steamship companies were making a fortune transporting prospectors via a long, slow route across the Isthmus of Panama. Vanderbilt saw an opportunity. He personally scouted a shorter, faster route across Nicaragua, hacking his way through jungles and charting rivers himself. He established the Accessory Transit Company, a grueling but efficient path of riverboats and stagecoaches that cut the journey to California by 2 days and hundreds of dollars. It was a massive gamble that infuriated the government-subsidized monopoly, but it paid off handsomely, pouring millions into his coffers and cementing his reputation as a fearless innovator. Later in life, when he was nearly 70, an age when most men of his wealth would have long since retired, He performed one of the most audacious pivots in business history. Seeing that the iron horse was supplanting the steamboat, he began systematically selling off his entire shipping empire to invest in a technology he knew was the future: railroads. He consolidated lines, modernized tracks, fought epic battles on Wall Street against legendary financiers like Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, and built the magnificent Grand Central Depot in New York, creating a transportation network that became the very circulatory system of the American economy. But to understand the fall, you must understand the man's soul. The Commodore was defined not by his wealth, but by his relationship to it. He saw money not as a means to comfort or luxury, but as a way of keeping score. It was a tool, an instrument of power, a measure of his victory over a world that had offered him nothing. It was his shield against the deep, gnawing fear of the poverty he had escaped. He lived his entire life in a relatively modest brownstone at 10 Washington Place in New York City, a comfortable but far from palatial home. He famously complained that his wife's parties were a waste of good money and was known to sneak down to the kitchens to check for wastefulness. He was known to water down the milk to save a few cents and saw no reason to give his dozen children a comfortable life, believing that unearned wealth bred weakness, a taint that rotted the soul. Any fool can make a fortune, he was fond of saying, but it takes a man of brains to hold on to it. He instilled in his children a deep-seated, almost sacred sense of financial discipline, but also a profound fear of his own tyrannical will. He treated his family like a business, with himself as the unquestioned CEO. He was notoriously cruel to his son Cornelius Jeremiah, a handsome but epileptic and irresponsible young man who he saw as a failure. He had him committed to an asylum and eventually cut him off almost completely. For years, he held his most capable son, William Henry, in utter contempt, banishing him to that farm on Staten Island and referring to him as a blatherskite. It was only when William Henry took a failing railroad and, through sheer methodical hard work, turned it into a profitable enterprise that the Commodore finally gave him a sliver of respect. He ruled his household through fear and financial control, teaching his children that his love, like his money, was something to be earned, never given freely. He wasn't just raising sons, he was forging his legacy, and the pressure on them, especially on his favored son, William Henry, was as immense as it was unspoken. And yet, it was this very foundation, this bedrock of Spartan discipline and relentless work, that would become the first casualty of the dynasty's success. The Commodore's philosophy was perfectly suited for building an empire, but it was utterly alien to the world his children and grandchildren would inhabit. He had amassed a fortune so vast that it was, in a very real sense, incomprehensible. He had created a dynasty, but he had failed to prepare his descendants for the corrosive, transformative power of the wealth he would leave behind. He built the foundation of wealth, sterling reputation, and immense power, and upon that formidable foundation, his heirs were not invited but expected to build something he would have despised, an American aristocracy. He gave them the money, but he could not give them his soul. The stage was set not for a choice, but for a destiny that had been designed for them, a destiny that would ultimately lead them to reject every principle their founder held dear. The ghost of the Commodore, with his frugal ways and his contempt for high society, would haunt the gilded halls of his descendants, a silent, disapproving specter, watching as they systematically dismantled everything he had built. The second and third generations of the Vanderbilt family were its golden age, the era where the patriarch's towering ambitions were realized on a scale that was at once a perfect fulfillment and a complete betrayal of his life's work. This historic triumph was not the story of a single solitary man, but a complex, fascinating interplay of personalities. A veritable family court with its own brilliant but insecure kings, its fiercely ambitious queens, and its indispensable behind-the-scenes financiers. Together, they would propel the Vanderbilt name to a height of social power unique in the American story, but in doing so, they would transform the family's ethos from one of creation to one of pure, unadulterated consumption. It was a seismic shift, a fundamental rewriting of the family's DNA. The Commodore had built an empire to conquer the world of commerce. His descendants would spend that empire to conquer the drawing rooms of Manhattan. This was not merely a change in spending habits, it was a change in soul. The gritty, relentless pursuit of profit was replaced by the equally relentless and far more expensive pursuit of prestige. At the very center of this transformation was William Henry Vanderbilt, the Commodore's eldest and once scorned son. For years, his father had dismissed him as a blatherskite, a weak and incompetent fool, a boy who lacked the killer instinct required to survive in the cutthroat world of 19th century business. The old man had even sent him away to manage a farm on Staten Island, a form of exile meant to toughen him up or, failing that, to keep him out of the way. But William Henry, in his quiet, methodical way, proved to be a business genius in his own right, a man whose patience and meticulous attention to detail were the perfect complement to his father's explosive, intuitive brilliance. When he inherited the bulk of the empire in 1877, he took his father's $100 million fortune and in less than a decade more than doubled it to nearly $200 million. He was, by any measure, the richest man in the world, a titan of industry whose influence was felt in every corner of the nation. But William Henry was a transitional figure, a man caught between two worlds, a reluctant Moses leading his family out of the Spartan wilderness of his father's creation and towards the glittering promised land of high society. He still possessed the Commodore's work ethic, rising early and working punishingly long hours at his desk, but he lacked his father's Spartan soul. He felt the immense pressure of his father's ghost, the weight of that impossible legacy, but he also felt the insistent pull of his own family's desires. He was the one who began the Great Migration, moving the family from their modest downtown homes to the opulent mansions of Fifth Avenue. He built what was known as the Triple Palace at 640 Fifth Avenue, a grand brownstone that housed himself and his two daughters, a concession to the relentless social ambitions of his wife and children. In a famous and often misquoted interview, when asked about the public's interest in his railroad operations, he gruffly muttered, "The public be damned," a phrase that perfectly captured the Commodore's disdain for public opinion, but also revealed William Henry's own discomfort with the growing scrutiny that came with their immense wealth. The Triple Palace was a fortress, a statement of their arrival, but it was still, by the standards that were to come, a relatively sober affair. It was the first fateful step away from the Commodore's ethos, the opening salvo in a war of extravagance that would consume his children. The true driving force behind the family's social ascent, however, was not the men, but a woman of formidable and brilliant will, Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt, the wife of William Henry's son, William K. Vanderbilt. Alva was a Southern belle from a once wealthy Mobile, Alabama family that had been ruined by the Civil War, and she possessed a burning, all-consuming ambition to conquer the impenetrable fortress of New York high society. In the 1880s, that society was a closed circle, an exclusive club of old Dutch and English families, the Knickerbocker elite, ruled with an iron fist by the Mrs. Astor, Caroline Astor. Mrs. Astor, with her quiet authority and her legendary pronouncements, was the absolute monarch of this world. Her approval could make a family. Her disapproval could render them invisible no matter how many millions they possessed. She famously declared that there were only about 400 people in New York society who truly mattered, a list that conveniently matched the capacity of her own ballroom. The Vanderbilts, with their new money derived from the grubby, noisy business of railroads, were emphatically not among them. To Mrs. Astor and her circle, they were vulgar, loud, and hopelessly common. Alva decided to lay siege to this fortress. She was not just a socialite, she was a general, and her weapons were architecture, extravagance, and media savvy. She understood that in this new Gilded Age, power flowed not from quiet lineage, but from public spectacle. She commissioned the architect Richard Morris Hunt to build her a breathtaking French chateau on Fifth Avenue, a limestone palace that became known as the Petit Chateau. It was a declaration of war in stone, a piece of European aristocracy dropped onto American soil, a direct challenge to the staid, respectable brownstones of the Astors. Then, in 1883, she planned her masterstroke, a massive housewarming costume ball, a party so lavish, so over the top, that it would be impossible for even Mrs. Astor to ignore. The reported cost was $250,000, the equivalent of more than $7 million today. The theme was a tribute to European royalty, and the press was fed a steady diet of tantalizing details about the floral arrangements, the champagne fountains, and the diamond-encrusted costumes. The newspapers of the day were filled with breathless accounts of the preparations, turning the party into the most anticipated social event in a generation. But Alva held one final brilliant card. She meticulously sent out the invitations, but she pointedly did not invite Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie. The message was clear and brutal. When Mrs. Astor, desperate for her daughter to attend the party of the century, sent a friend to inquire why, Alva delivered her famous, perfectly calibrated reply. She could not possibly invite Miss Astor because Mrs. Astor had never formally called upon her. It was a checkmate. To be excluded from the Vanderbilt ball would be a public humiliation for the Astors, a sign that their reign was over. That very afternoon, Caroline Astor's carriage was seen outside the Vanderbilt mansion, leaving a calling card. The fortress had been breached. The Vanderbilts had arrived. The ball was a legendary success, a spectacle of such dazzling extravagance that it dominated the newspapers for days. Alva's sister-in-law, Alice Vanderbilt, came dressed as the Electric Light, a gown of white satin trimmed with diamonds that was lit from within by a hidden battery. Alva herself came as a Venetian princess. From that moment on, the Vanderbilts were not just rich, they were socially paramount. This victory, however, came at a profound cost. It established a new standard for the family, a new definition of success. The game was no longer about outmaneuvering competitors in business. It was about outshining rivals in society. This triggered an arms race of consumption, a potlatch of epic proportions. The battlefield shifted from Manhattan to the summer colony of Newport, Rhode Island, where the great families of New York went to escape the city heat and to engage in a relentless competition of leisure and display. Alva, flushed with her victory, built Marble House, an $11 million summer cottage made of solid marble, a birthday present for herself. It was a temple to art and to her own ego, with a gold ballroom that was said to have cost more than the White House. Her brother-in-law, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, not to be outdone, built the breakers next door, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace that was even larger and more opulent. It was a house built for a Medici prince, with a great hall that soared 2 stories high and a dining room with walls of platinum leaf. They were building these houses not for comfort, but as weapons in a social war, each one a declaration of their supremacy. While the second generation built the palaces, the third generation was born into them. They grew up in a world where money was an abstract concept, a limitless resource that flowed from some distant, unseen source. Their childhood was a blur of private tutors, trips to Europe, and summers in Newport. Their education was in art, literature, and the proper way to host a dinner party. They learned to sail yachts, to ride polo ponies, and to distinguish between a Monet and a Manet. They were groomed not to be businessmen, but to be gentlemen of leisure, American princes and princesses. The very qualities that had built the empire, the thrift, the grit, the relentless focus on work, were now seen as vulgar, as relics of a cruder, less refined past. The family's financial engine, the New York Central Railroad, was still churning out massive profits, but it was now a vast impersonal bureaucracy run by a team of professional managers. Fewer and fewer family members had any interest in or knowledge of how to run it. They were absentee landlords of their own fortune, content to clip the coupons from their bonds and spend the proceeds on their increasingly extravagant lifestyles. The gilded cage had been built, its doors gleaming with gold. But for the generations to come, those beautiful doors would prove to be an inescapable trap. For every great dynasty, for every seemingly unstoppable rise, there is a moment of crisis, a point where the very foundations are tested and the hidden cracks begin to spiderweb their way to the surface. For the Vanderbilt dynasty, that fracture was not a slow, gentle decline, but a series of sudden, violent, and deeply personal earthquakes. It was a schism that would pit father against son, mother against daughter, and in doing so, reveal the profound hidden costs of the power they had so painstakingly acquired. The very values that had conspired to lift the Vanderbilts to the pinnacle of society, their obsession with status, their belief in dynastic purity, and their use of marriage as a strategic tool would be the very things to tear their family and their fortune apart. This was not a conflict that erupted overnight. Its seeds were sown in the fundamental shift from the Commodore's brutal pragmatism to his descendants' obsession with social validation. The old man saw his children as employees and his fortune as a tool for business. His grandchildren saw their children as assets and their fortune as a tool for social climbing. This philosophical chasm became a gaping, unbridgeable canyon, and the casualties were the happiness and autonomy of the next generation. The Commodore's raw ambition was a force of creation. His descendants' ambition was a force of social engineering, and the human collateral damage would be immense. They were no longer building an empire of steel and steam. They were building a fragile empire of appearances, and its maintenance required absolute, unquestioning loyalty from its subjects. The relationship between Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his eldest son, Cornelius Vanderbilt III, or Neely, was for years the very model of a Gilded Age dynastic succession. Neely was the golden boy, the heir apparent, groomed from birth to take his place at the head of the family. He was brilliant, charming, and dutiful, a graduate of Yale who seemed poised to carry the family name to even greater heights. His father, the stern and deeply conservative head of the family, a man who had inherited his grandfather's work ethic but channeled it into the rigid maintenance of social order, saw in him the perfect vessel for the family's future. There was just one unspoken rule: the dynasty always came first. The family was not a collection of individuals, it was a corporation, and each member had a role to play in enhancing the value of its brand. But Neely committed the one unforgivable sin in his father's eyes. He fell in love with the wrong person. The object of his affection was Grace Wilson, the daughter of a prominent New York banker. By any normal standard, she was a magnificent catch. She was beautiful, intelligent, and her family was wealthy. Her father, Richard T. Wilson, was a self-made man who had built a banking fortune and was a respected figure in his own right. But the Wilsons were not part of the rarefied, exclusive circle of old money families that Cornelius II had spent his entire life and fortune trying to conquer. The Wilsons were seen as respectable, but they lacked the sacred, almost mystical patina of old lineage. They were newcomers. In the intricate, unforgiving caste system of Gilded Age New York, this was a fatal flaw. Cornelius II saw the marriage not as a misstep, but as an act of rebellion, a public slap in the face. He believed it would dilute the family's hard-won social standing, undoing all the work of his generation. It was a strategic misalliance, and in his world, there was no greater crime. The resulting conflict was a spectacle of Shakespearean proportions, a battle for the soul of the young heir. It was a quiet, cold war, waged not with shouts but with icy silences and pronouncements delivered through intermediaries. Cornelius II forbade the marriage, threatening his son with complete and total disinheritance. Imagine the pressure, the agonizing choice placed before the young man. On one side was the woman he loved, a future of personal happiness. On the other side was everything he had ever known, his family, his name, the vast, imposing structure of the breakers, and a share in one of the world's greatest fortunes. For months, the battle raged within the family's marble mansions. Neely's mother pleaded with him. His siblings urged him to reconsider. But Neely, who had inherited a stubborn streak from his great-grandfather, refused to yield. In the end, he made his choice. In a stunning act of defiance, he married Grace Wilson in 1896. His father, true to his word, was merciless. He did not storm or rage. His response was far colder and more terrifying. It was the quiet, methodical erasure of his son from the family's future. He immediately cut his son off, and upon his death in 1899, delivered the final brutal blow. His will, a document that became the talk of the town, was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. He left the vast majority of his estate, some $70 million, to Neely's younger brother, Alfred, a young man known more for his love of horses and coaching than for his business acumen. Neely, the firstborn son, the one who had been raised to lead, was left with a mere $1.5 million. It was a fortune, to be sure, but in the context of the Vanderbilt dynasty, it was a pittance, a public and humiliating disavowal. The pain of this betrayal ran incredibly deep. Neely was effectively cast out, forced to make his own way in the world. He would go on to become a distinguished soldier, serving in the military with distinction, and a successful inventor, patenting over 30 devices for improving locomotives and freight cars. But he was forever the exiled prince, a living symbol of the dynasty's capacity for self-destruction, a man who had been sacrificed on the altar of his father's social pride. If Neely's story was a tragedy of defiance, his cousin Consuelo's was a tragedy of submission. Her story is perhaps the most famous and heartbreaking of all the dollar princesses, the American heiresses, who were married off to titled but impoverished European aristocrats. Her mother Alva, the social general who had conquered New York, saw one final world to conquer, the British aristocracy. And she saw in her slender, beautiful, and sensitive daughter the perfect bargaining chip. To Alva, Consuelo was not a daughter to be loved and nurtured, but a masterpiece to be sculpted and ultimately sold to the highest bidder. Consuelo was a pawn from the beginning. She was raised with an almost military discipline, forced to wear a steel rod strapped to her back to improve her posture, her every move and every friendship scrutinized by her domineering mother. She was secretly engaged to an American man she loved, Winthrop Rutherford, a man of impeccable lineage but lacking a title. To Alva, this was an unacceptable provincial ambition. She had set her sights on a far greater prize. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, the master of the magnificent but financially draining Blenheim Palace. The Duke, a cold and arrogant man, was in desperate need of cash to restore his ancestral home and maintain his aristocratic lifestyle. Alva was in desperate need of a ducal title for her daughter. It was a perfect, if utterly heartless, match. The courtship was a farce, orchestrated with military precision by Alva. When Consuelo resisted, her mother resorted to a campaign of emotional blackmail and psychological warfare that was nothing short of monstrous. She feigned a fatal heart condition, claiming her daughter's disobedience would kill her. She locked Consuelo in her room, intercepted her letters, and, in a final terrifying threat, told her she would murder the man she loved if she did not break off the engagement. Finally, the young girl, only 18 years old, her spirit broke. She agreed to the marriage. As she later wrote in her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, "I spent the morning of my wedding in tears and alone. No one came near me." The wedding in 1895 was the social event of the decade, a transatlantic spectacle. But behind the veil, the bride was weeping. The cost of the title was staggering. The Vanderbilts paid the Duke a dowry of $2.5 million in railroad stock, the equivalent of more than $80 million today. They also pledged an additional annual income for life. It was a massive financial drain, a significant portion of the family's capital exported to prop up a foreign aristocrat's crumbling estate. The Commodore's hard-won American fortune was being used to patch the leaking roof of the British aristocracy. The marriage was a catastrophe. The Duke was cold, arrogant, and openly disdainful of his American bride. He famously informed her on their honeymoon that he had only married her for her money, and that he intended to continue his relationship with his longtime mistress. Consuelo was trapped in a loveless union, a prisoner in the magnificent halls of Blenheim Palace. She was the Duchess of Marlborough, one of the highest-ranking women in England, but she was desperately unhappy. While she eventually carved out a life for herself, earning the respect of British society for her intelligence and her tireless charitable work, her personal happiness had been sacrificed on the altar of her mother's ambition. The marriage eventually ended in a bitter divorce, but the damage had been done, not just to Consuelo but to the family fortune. The story of Consuelo Vanderbilt is the ultimate cautionary tale of the Gilded Age, a stark reminder of how the relentless pursuit of status can lead a family to sell not only its assets, but its own children. It was the apotheosis of the Vanderbilts' new ethos, a transaction so cold, so public, and so ruinously expensive that it perfectly symbolized the hollowing out of the family's soul. But while the stories of Neely and Consuelo were tales of tragic, unfulfilled lives, the dynasty's story had another, more tangible, and deeply symbolic third act: the slow, inexorable decay of the very monuments they had built to proclaim their permanence. The great mansions of Fifth Avenue and the seaside palaces of Newport, once the theaters of their social triumphs, became the magnificent marble-clad tombstones of their decline. After the crushing human cost of their social wars, The Vanderbilts would now face the crushing financial cost of the world they had created. These were not just houses, they were declarations, physical embodiments of a fortune so vast it seemed to defy the laws of economic gravity. Their fall, therefore, was not just a real estate transaction. It was a surrender, a public admission that the magic was gone. William Howard Taft, a contemporary and a man who understood the burdens of a famous name, once remarked on the fleeting nature of great fortunes. For the Vanderbilts, this lesson was learned not in the classroom, but in the cold, empty halls of their own homes. The great flaw in their strategy was this: they had built their palaces as though their income would be infinite and eternal. They had failed to account for changing tastes, economic depressions, and the single most transformative financial force of the 20th century, the income tax. The Commodore had built his empire on the solid bedrock of reinvested profits and brutal efficiency. His grandchildren built their social standing on a foundation of French limestone and Italian marble, a foundation that required constant, massive infusions of cash just to keep from sinking under its own weight. Imagine for a moment the psychological weight of these houses. For the generation that built them, they were trophies, glittering symbols of their victory in the social wars. But for the generations that inherited them, they were not homes. They were museums to a past they had not created and a lifestyle they could barely comprehend. They were born into the role of curators, their lives dedicated to the preservation of a legacy that felt less like a gift and more like a sentence. The pressure was immense. Every chipped piece of marble, every faded tapestry was not just a maintenance issue. It was a sign of failure, a personal affront to the memory of their powerful ancestors. They were living in mausoleums, their days dictated by the needs of the house, not the desires of their own hearts. The very architecture was a form of control. The grand, formal spaces demanded a rigid, formal lifestyle. The endless succession of drawing rooms, ballrooms, and dining halls were not designed for quiet family life. They were designed for performance, for the constant, exhausting theater of high society. To live in a house like the Breakers was to be perpetually on stage, a prisoner in a gilded cage of your own inheritance. The houses were not just homes, they were small cities, each a self-contained ecosystem of extravagance. The Breakers in Newport, with its 70 rooms, required a full-time staff of nearly 40 just for the household, including footmen, maids, cooks, and laundresses. Another 20 gardeners and stable hands were needed for the grounds. The mansion had its own power plant, a technological marvel for its time, but one that consumed tons of coal each week. The annual coal bill for heating the cavernous structure was astronomical, often exceeding the entire lifetime earnings of the men who shoveled the coal into its furnaces. The property taxes, even in the early 20th century, were a significant burden. Multiplying this across a dozen such properties in New York, Newport, and the Biltmore estate in North Carolina, the family was facing an annual maintenance bill that ran into the millions, all in an era before the great bull market of the 1920s. It was a lifestyle sustained by the relentless churning engine of the American railroad, and when that engine began to sputter, the lights in the great houses began to flicker, and for most of the year, these magnificent theaters were dark. The Newport cottages were used for, at most, 6 to 8 weeks during the summer season. For the other 10 months of the year, they sat silent and empty, shrouded in dust covers, a skeletal staff of caretakers wandering their echoing halls. The immense investment, the staggering running costs, all for a few weeks of frantic socializing. It was a level of conspicuous consumption that was not just extravagant, it was fundamentally unsustainable, a bonfire of a fortune that could not burn forever. For a time they managed. They were, after all, the Vanderbilts. But the introduction of the federal income tax in 1913 and the estate tax that followed changed the game forever. The massive passive income that flowed from the railroad stocks was no longer a tax-free river of gold. Suddenly, a significant portion of their income was being siphoned off by the federal government, a concept that would have been anathema to the Commodore. It was a seismic shift, a puncturing of the bubble of their financial invincibility. Then, the Great Depression dealt the final devastating blow. Railroad profits plummeted. Stock portfolios evaporated. The world that had supported this incredible extravagance had simply ceased to exist. The Gilded Age was over, but the Vanderbilts were still left with its gilded bills. The fall of the houses was a slow, painful, and public humiliation. It began with the quiet closing of entire wings. Dust sheets were draped over priceless French furniture. Chandeliers were no longer lit. Then came the auctions. As priceless French furniture, old master paintings, and Chinese porcelains were sold off to pay the bills. It was a discreet but steady hemorrhage of the family's cultural capital, a quiet admission that they could no longer afford the treasures they had spent a generation acquiring. The first great casualty was the heart of the empire, Fifth Avenue. In 1926, the heirs of Cornelius Vanderbilt II sold his magnificent mansion, the largest private home ever built in New York City, to a developer. It was torn down to make way for the Bergdorf Goodman department store. One by one, the other palaces followed. Within 2 decades, nearly every single Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, the grandest stretch of residential real estate in the world, had been demolished. Vanderbilt Row was no more. The chateaux and palazzos that had once proclaimed their dominance were reduced to rubble and dust, their ghosts lingering only in old photographs and the memories of a bygone era. The final act played out in Newport, the family's summer capital. Alva's marble house was sold off in the 1930s. The Breakers, the family's Parthenon, held on the longest, a symbol of their stubborn pride. But by the 1940s, the children of Cornelius II could no longer afford the upkeep. In a move of quiet desperation, they leased the house to the Preservation Society of Newport County for a symbolic $1 a year. Finally, in 1972, the family sold the house outright for a mere $365,000. The palace that had cost $7 million to build, the equivalent of over $200 million today, was sold for the price of a suburban tract home. Imagine the quiet dignity and the profound sense of failure that must have accompanied that transaction. The Countess Gladys Szechenyi, Cornelius II's daughter, handing over the keys to the house she had known her entire life, a house that had once hosted royalty, for a sum that would barely have covered its annual coal bill in its heyday. It was a quiet, almost mundane end to a story that had begun with such grandeur and consequence. The great-grandsons of the Commodore were now forced to sell off the family jewels simply to stay afloat. The scandal was not in some criminal act, but in the quiet public shame of their insolvency. The long, slow fade was finally becoming a rapid, undeniable collapse. The Vanderbilt dynasty, as a vital and consequential force in American life, was living on borrowed time. The monuments they had built to last for centuries had barely lasted for a single lifetime. They were hollow crowns, beautiful and empty, the perfect symbols of a fortune that had been spent on appearances, leaving nothing of substance behind. After the towering historic heights reached by the Commodore and the fierce, glittering battles waged by his formidable children and grandchildren, The ongoing story of the Vanderbilt dynasty becomes one of a long, slow, and almost elegiac fade from the national stage. The intense fire of ambition that had burned so brightly and with such consequence for 2 generations began to cool, replaced by a quieter, more modest, and more local sense of public service. The name still carried immense weight and prestige, especially in the society columns and the halls of philanthropy, but the era of the Vanderbilts as a dominant history-shaping force in the American economy was drawing to a close. The succeeding generations were honorable echoes of a powerful past, not the ambitious architects of a new future. They were no longer titans, but caretakers of a dwindling legacy, haunted by the ghosts of what had been and burdened by the upkeep of a world they had not created and could no longer afford. The other children of the second generation had already chosen paths that led them far away from the blinding glare of high finance. George Washington Vanderbilt II, the youngest son of William Henry, was perhaps the most telling example of this generational shift. He was a scholar and a connoisseur, a quiet, introspective man with a deep love for books, art, and the natural world. In a family of ruthless businessmen and flamboyant socialites, he was an intellectual and an aesthete. He had no interest in the brutal world of Wall Street or the intricate chess game of Newport society. Instead, he poured his entire inheritance into the creation of a single, breathtaking work of art, the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. It remains the largest private home in America, a 250-room French Renaissance chateau surrounded by thousands of acres of meticulously landscaped gardens. Biltmore was not just a house, it was a vision, a self-contained European-style estate with its own farms, a dairy, a church, and a village for its workers. It was also home to America's first managed forest, a pioneering effort in scientific conservation. It was a cultural triumph, a masterpiece of architecture and landscape design that stands to this day. But it was a financial disaster. The estate was a bottomless pit of expenses, a project of such monumental scale that it consumed not only George's initial inheritance, but the ongoing income from his trusts as well. By the time of his early death in 1914, at the age of just 51, the Biltmore estate had consumed the bulk of his fortune. He left his widow, Edith, with a magnificent but almost unsustainable property. To save it, she was forced to sell off over 80,000 acres of the estate's pristine forest land to the federal government, land that would become nucleus of the Pisgah National Forest. Ultimately, during the depths of the Great Depression, she made the difficult decision to open the house to the public, transforming the family's private sanctuary into a tourist destination, simply to generate enough income to keep it from crumbling. George's dream was a beautiful one, but like so many of his family's grand ambitions, it was built on a financial foundation that was simply unsustainable. The direct financial line of the Commodore was continuing, but with clearly diminishing force. The vast fortune, which had been so carefully concentrated by the founder, was now being scattered. William Henry had divided his estate among his 8 children. They in turn divided it among theirs. With each generation, the great fortune was splintered into smaller and smaller pieces. A family that once owned a single monolithic empire now consisted of dozens of wealthy, but not super rich, households. The old saying, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, was playing out on the most epic scale imaginable. The Commodore had built a mighty river of wealth. His son William Henry had widened it into a vast lake, but their descendants had dug 1,000 irrigation ditches, diverting the water to their own private gardens, until the Great Lake had dwindled into a series of shallow, disconnected ponds. The final act of the Vanderbilt financial dynasty, the closing chapter of this century-long saga, played out fittingly in the glare of the modern media. Gloria Vanderbilt, the great-great-granddaughter of the Commodore, became a celebrity in her own right, but not because of her inherited wealth. Her childhood was a tabloid spectacle, the subject of a sensational custody battle in the 1930s that dubbed her the poor little rich girl. The trial was a national obsession, a sordid affair that pitted her glamorous, globe-trotting mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, against her powerful and formidable aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. The courtroom drama exposed the family's deepest secrets to the world, tales of alcoholism, neglect, and bitter resentments, forever stripping the Vanderbilt name of its regal mystique. Gloria grew up to be an artist, an actress, and a fashion icon who built her own fortune in the 1970s, not with railroads, but with a line of designer blue jeans that bore her famous name. In a brilliant act of modern branding, she took the one asset she had left, the name itself, and turned it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. She was a testament to the family's resilience, but also to the fact that the original fortune was, for all practical purposes, gone. But it was her son, the CNN anchor, Anderson Cooper, who delivered the dynasty's final poignant epitaph. In a series of startlingly candid interviews, he confirmed what had long been suspected. The great Vanderbilt fortune had vanished. "My mom made it clear to me that there's no trust fund," he told Howard Stern in 2014, a statement that was picked up by newspapers around the world. "There's none of that." He went even further, explaining that he considered inherited money to be a curse, a motivation-sapping burden that he was glad to be free of. "I don't believe in inheriting money," he said. "I think it's a curse. From the time I was growing up, if I felt that there was some pot of gold waiting for me, I don't know that I would have been so motivated." It was a quiet, almost mundane end to a financial story that had begun with such grandeur and consequence. The great-grandson of William Henry Vanderbilt, the richest man in the world, had to get a job. The scandal was not monumental in the grand, sordid scheme of American history, but its symbolic weight was immense. It tarnished the one thing the family, throughout its long history, had always held most dear: its reputation for unimaginable wealth. The long, slow fade was finally complete. The Vanderbilt dynasty, as a vital and consequential force in American economic life, was over. The great river of wealth that had flowed from the Commodore's ambition had, after a century of irrigating the fields of high society, finally run dry. Looking back across the long sweep of the decades, the story of the Vanderbilt dynasty emerges as the quintessential American saga. It is not a story of public service, but of private, world-conquering ambition. It is a dramatic epic of a patriarch's iron will clashing with his descendants' desires, of an empire built on grit being spent on glamour, and of the immense, often crushing weight of a family name that became synonymous with both the American dream and its spectacular implosion. Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt was the architect, a ruthless 19th century titan who built a formidable foundation of discipline and raw ambition. He dreamed of a fortune that would serve as a monument to his own victory over hardship, and his son, William Henry, honored that legacy by doubling it. They were singular figures in American capitalism, men who reached the absolute pinnacle of the economic world. But that same shining legacy is inextricably, tragically linked to the social wars that followed. The story of the third generation is a Shakespearean tragedy of the Gilded Age, a generation born into such immense privilege that they saw their life's singular purpose not in creating wealth, but in spending it with a theatrical and ultimately ruinous extravagance. The dynasty that followed was one of honorable echoes, of quiet scholars and fading socialites, a long and graceful fade that ended not with a bang, but with the quiet public admission of an empty bank account. The Vanderbilt family's story forces us to confront our fundamental relationship with money itself. What is the true price of ambition, both for the one who possesses it and for the generations who must live in its shadow? What happens to a great and powerful dynasty when the ferocious fire of that initial world-conquering drive finally burns itself out, leaving only the cold embers of a famous name? Their journey is a uniquely American story, one of immense achievement and profound loss. As the name now resides in the annals of history, it leaves behind the powerful ghosts of its past, the raw genius of the Commodore, the unfulfilled dreams of the Dollar Princess, and the quiet struggles of the generations destined to live in their formidable, inescapable shadows. It is a story that is truly and finally complete. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Vanderbilt dynasty. It's a story that reminds us that in the grand ledger of history, the greatest titles and the highest offices are often just the public face of a much more complicated, much more conflicted, and much more human story. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that look behind the legends. We'll see you next time.